Bennett. I'm the Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our Economics of a Pandemic webinar series. The Australia Institute is one of the country's most influential independent think tanks, and we're based in Canberra, and I want to thank all of our supporters who normally come to our in-person events for coming along to things like our Why Economics is Broken tour, our national speaking tour that we did at the beginning of the year, and thank you for joining us online. And I particularly want to thank everyone who's new to the Australia Institute who's joining us today, and particularly those from the Saturday paper who've joined us from there. Thank you so much. We're so thrilled that you're here. And during this pandemic, the Australia Institute is aiming to do these webinars at least weekly. But days and times may vary, so please make sure that you're subscribed to get all of our updates at tai.org.au so you don't miss out. And just a few tips before we begin so that you can participate in this webinar and we get the most out of it. So first of all, please bear with us. This is only our third webinar, and so we still basically have L plates as we drive this system. So please bear with us if we have any technical difficulties. If you hover over the bottom of your screen, there's a bit of a menu there, and you should be able to see a Q&A function where you can ask questions of our panelists. And also, if you'd like to raise a question directly, we'll be taking questions in the second half of this webinar, and you can use the raise your hand function, and I'll try and call on you to ask your question live. If we get Zoom bombed, which has happened to a few other webinars, or trolls start posting nasty things in the chat, we might temporarily disable that chat function, but hopefully we won't have to do that. So please keep it civil in there. And lastly, this discussion is being recorded and will be posted on our website. And will be emailed to all attendees after the discussion. So today's special guest is Wayne Swan, the National President of the Labor Party, former Deputy Prime Minister, and the Treasurer who helped steer Australia's economy through the global financial crisis without going into recession. Labor's stimulus package has been criticised by the coalition, ironically, now for at least the past 10 years or so, as too big, which is quite something if you think about the scale of the fiscal measures that they've unleashed in the last couple of weeks. So there's really no one better that we could talk to today about the complete reshaping of Australia's economy, and he'll be in conversation with our Chief Economist, Richard Dennis. But to kick off, I'll throw over to you, Wayne Swan. Wayne, how much has coronavirus changed the shape of Australia's economy?
Well, I think it's completely changed the global economic and political landscape. There's not been an event of this magnitude since the Great Depression. I'd just like to make a couple of points. And first of all, I want to thank everyone for joining today. I particularly want to thank my daughter Libby, who was in lockdown in New York in her 27th day. So I want to acknowledge that because it's one way of looking at why this crisis is substantially different from past crises. Effectively, we've got a health crisis and it's accompanied by an economic crisis. And what we are really witnessing is probably the biggest drop in global demand and domestic demand that has been seen since the Great Depression. So I welcome the package that was outlined by the government yesterday. It's badly needed, and I think every Australian has a stake in its success. But what we ought to do, and we ought to be very clear about this, is that we ought to be able to have a discussion about the structure of the package, about what Australia would look like as we come out the other side, and I think pretty importantly, who pays for the package, not just now, but in the long run. As I said before, the biggest drop in demand, fastest drop in demand that perhaps we've ever seen. And it is deeply ironic that we've got a Prime Minister who has for the last 12 years demonised fiscal stimulus, particularly the second package that we put in place in 2009, which averted a recession, that he would adopt a package this big. That's a surprising response in some ways, but certainly a welcome one. But I'd like to suggest that essentially this crisis shines a light, I think, on a fundamental truth that guides my thinking about economics and about politics. And it's very simple. The fact is we live in a community, not in a corporation. And what we are now seeing is, if you like, all of the weaknesses of the trickle-down model on show. Very clear. A bright light is shining on the fact that that trickle-down model of tax cuts for the wealthy, deregulation for the powerful, poking holes in the social safety net and suppressing wages is completely impotent, if you like, in the face of a crisis of this magnitude. So I've seen some commentary that says we're all socialists now. I would like to suggest that maybe some are only socialists because we're in a pandemic. So what we need to do is have a discussion about the principles that underlie our thinking about how we respond to recession and how we actually do come out the other side, because it's not taken for granted that the rest of the world is suddenly going to embrace a collective ethos just as a result of this crisis. We've already seen what happened after the global financial crisis and the Great Recession, that the world went back to normal after the Great Recession. It should never be forgotten that many developed economies from 2008 through to about 2014, 15 were experiencing deep recessions and continued to apply the same policies in many ways as they had applied prior to that crisis. So when it comes to the global financial crisis, as it is known here, or the Great Recession, I don't think the world learnt the lessons of that crisis. So what I'd like to run through is what should we be doing? What should change in our thinking as we go forward dealing with this crisis? Well, I think it's pretty clear that we should be in a position to say that government must be larger and must play a much more active role in our economy. I think it also demonstrates to us that public services such as health and education aren't just expenditure, they are absolutely vital investments. They're most certainly not liabilities. Thirdly, that labour markets should be more secure and therefore more regulated. And I think lastly, and perhaps most importantly, that there is a need for redistribution in modern developed and developing economies where the privileges of the wealthy are challenged and where policy is based on a progressive tax system and on a stronger voice for labour in the economy and in society more generally. So I think as we go on and talk about the structure of this stimulus and talk about what the future is like, I would like to imagine a future where fiscal policy played a far greater role and we didn't rely on the low tax, small government mantra that has dominated so much of the politics and ideology across the Western world for the last 30 or 40 years, that we now come to the conclusion that it's vital that some of our frontline workers are the most important workers in our economy, and that they should not be put in the precarious position that they have been put in. What are we going to do to recognise the contribution of all of our workforce, and indeed to reach the conclusion that the most fundamental asset we have in an economy is the health of our workforce? I think that is something we need to talk about as well. So I might just leave it there and throw to Richard.
Well, thanks so much, Wayne. And yeah, I think it's fascinating to compare the lessons, not just of the global financial crisis, but the lessons of how we responded to it. Wayne, you and I were involved in plenty of conversations last year and the year before about marking the 10-year anniversary of the global financial crisis. And I think it's very important that we all remember that 10 years after the GFC, we were only just having a royal commission into the finance sector and only just discovering kind of how rotten some of the apples in that barrel were. After the GFC, unfortunately, a lot of people seem to think it was just back to business as usual. So I think it's really important for us as citizens and as people that are interested in policy, not to kid ourselves. We shouldn't tell ourselves that it's inevitable that at the end of this crisis, big things will change. The only way that big things get changed is when we change them. And that's there's nothing inevitable about that. But before I ask you a question, Wayne, I guess I just want to make another observation, and that is that I think we have to be really careful in in discussing and evaluating what the government's doing at the moment, we have to be really careful to separate out the lessons that we can draw from the past, including, I think, the very successful stimulus package that kept us out of the GFC. We have to be careful in evaluating what the government's doing at the moment by that rule book, because what's happening now is, in some ways, it starts off the same way. It looks the same at the beginning. We see the economy slowing. We see the government stepping in and spending some money. But it's inconceivable that in 2009, your government or any government would have stepped in as the economy was slowing and literally shut down all of tourism and literally shut down nearly all of the food and hospitality industry. This slowdown looks like a recession, but it's actually health policy, rightly, that's crushing, 20% of GDP at the moment down to nearly nothing. And as a consequence of that, because the government is literally causing most of this recession, only the public sector, I would argue, only the public sector is big enough to drag the rest of the economy through that. But also, given that it's the public sector literally causing this slowdown, I think equity demands that the public sector steps in to do as much as it can to help fill that hole, because this hole is literally being caused by government policy. So I guess my first question to you, Wayne, is, where do you see the similarities and where do you see the differences? You saw the terrifying Treasury briefs in 2009, I'm sure. What do you think's different and the same about this one?
Well, the briefs in 2009 were terrifying. I remember the Christmas of 2008, 2009, going to New York and attending a meeting with the Fed. That's when Chinese growth had gone to zero. And the Fed there advised us that overwhelming force is necessary, otherwise the world will have a Great Depression. So that's where it was in 2009 before we put in place our $42 billion second stimulus package, which in today's dollars is about the equivalent of 80 billion. That was the one that has been demonised by this government for the last 12 years. That second package is really important in the context of our current environment, because we're going to have an even bigger demand shock for all the reasons that you just outlined, with very significant parts of the economy shut down. And there is, in my view, very little chance, as the Prime Minister has been saying, is that we can snap back, if you like, in 6 months' time. The truth is that not only is there a big hit to demand in Australia, we are going to face very tough international headwinds for some time. So the success of our second stimulus in 2009 wasn't just the cash payments that went to individuals, but it was putting in place a pipeline of investment across the economy to give employers some faith that the government would be a partner with them in making sure that critical infrastructure was built in our community. So there was a very big package for social housing. There was a very big package for buildings in schools. And there are another few packages as part of all of that. That was a pipeline of work. And I frequently say that the reason our two stimuluses were successful was because the combination of boosting households on the one hand and providing a pipeline of work on the other produced a stimulus that was greater than the sum of its parts. And what I'm quite alarmed about in the Prime Minister's language at the moment is there doesn't appear to be anything on the horizon after the 6 months stop, if you like, of the wage subsidies. It will be absolutely essential that somebody comes to the table, whether it's the private sector or the government, and does ensure there's a pipeline of work for the future, because the economics of this are pretty clear. If the government withdraws stimulus at a faster rate than new private sector spending comes through the pipeline, then we will lurch again back to recession if we haven't already climbed out. So I think the government is a little exposed in this area. I've noted the Prime Minister is no longer using that word snapback, but I don't think that they'll get the full value from this current stimulus unless they can convince employers that there is going to be a pipeline of demand beyond the 6 month period.
Can I just interrupt there, Wayne? I wondered if, we're talking a lot about the actual specifics of what's happening, but Going back to that awful moment that you were talking about back in 2009, like, can you comment on, I guess, the difference in the politics now compared to the politics back then? Because this has really been portrayed as kind of, you know, that idea of Team Australia, and it's a national effort and we're all in it together. But I didn't necessarily get that same sense back in
Well,
the GFC.
we were viciously attacked in the parliament and in the community, not only at the time of the passage of the second stimulus, but more broadly for the next 12 years. The tragedy of the second stimulus, that people forget this, it was opposed by the Liberal and National parties in the House. On its first run through the Senate, it was defeated on the votes of the Liberals and minor parties, which really sent a shockwave through the country. And it had to come back to the House of Reps. We came to an accommodation with some of the minor parties and subsequently went through the Senate. So all that is washed away in this discussion of Team Australia. I'm all for Team Australia. This is an existential moment for our country. People's lives are on the line. And it does require an extraordinary economic response, which is free of ideology. The Prime Minister now said, and he said it in the House yesterday, that he was putting aside ideology. I'm delighted to hear it, because he didn't do it for the 12 years, and certainly didn't do it in his commentary then in the Parliament on the passage of those bills. So it will be good if the leopard has changed his spots, that there is a sudden conversion to a more Keynesian approach to our economics in the face of the brutal reality of the biggest drop in demand since the Great Depression. And I'm delighted to see that my party is playing a constructive role, and its input has vastly changed some of the measures in this third package. In fact, it was our suggestion to go for wage subsidies. But apart from that, they don't really, to me, appear to be too interested in a broader engagement and bipartisanship. Otherwise, they wouldn't still be taking pot shots back at a package that saved us from recession 12 years ago. So what that sort of says to me is that I don't necessarily think they've turned into socialists for long. And we need to be very aware as we come out of this to ensure that the price that has to be paid for all of these measures isn't borne unreasonably by the people who have already been the principal victims of the outcome of this drop in demand, namely the lower paid people in our workforce, the unemployed, the frail and the vulnerable.
It's interesting to hear you talk about the Prime Minister's comments on ideology, Wayne. I mean, so much of what we've heard for the last decade is about, you know, debt and deficits and the need to pay it down and all that sort of stuff. But it's also important to remember that, yeah, you know, back when Labor was coming up with the stimulus packages, the coalition was always sort of flirting with this idea of, they supported the principle of stimulus, but then they always sort of quibbled over the size or the shape of it. It always reminded me of Bill Clinton saying, you know, he smoked a joint at college, but he didn't inhale. Yeah, well, seems to be the coalition.
Can I say, Richard, I've had that feeling as I've been watching not just the politicians, but many in the media, because the truth is that the vicious attacks that were launched on our second stimulus were aided and abetted largely by sections of the media. And it always became impossible for me as Treasurer to go and sit on a program, even an ABC program, and not be peppered from dawn to dusk with questions about the size of the stimulus, deficit and debt, and how unsustainable it was for the country. Well, we had an answer to that. We had an answer to that in 2011 and 2012, because Australia not only came through as the only advanced country not to go into recession, we then had the strongest growth of any advanced economy for a good half a dozen years. But that was never allowed to really surface or to penetrate, if you like, the broader public debate.
Richard, sorry, I just wondered if I could ask you, I mean, we're talking about the complete reshaping of Australia's economy, and obviously we're seeing the government doing things that we never pictured this government would do before. Richard, can you just comment on how much this has shifted, I guess, the idea of what's possible and what government can or can't do?
Well, in some sense, there's been obviously an enormous shift. Like we've seen the government spend, well, let's go back a step. Having come to power promising to pay down debt and deficits, the coalition have been in deficit ever since they came to power. Debt increased, the world didn't end, the sky didn't fall. So was clearly always an exaggeration. But despite that, the rhetoric had sort of stayed the same. We need to spend less. We need to, cut our cloth to suit our means, all those sort of household metaphors. But in the last 20 days, the government spent around $200 billion. Now, to give people some perspective on that, in a normal year, the government would spend a bit over $400 billion. In 20 days, it spent $200 billion. And at those press conferences, especially the one where the wage subsidy was first announced, not a single journalist asked, where will the money come from?
How will we pay for it?
How will we pay for it? Right. So for decades, if someone said we should spend more on addressing domestic violence or spend more helping young kids stuck in aged care homes because there's no good housing for young people with chronic disabilities, or God forbid we spend some more money trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the question that you have to ask to be serious is, how will it be funded? Well, we just spent $200 billion in 20 days. And finally, as Wayne said, the media just stopped asking silly questions, because the fact is we're one of the richest countries in the world. We live at the richest point in world history. And when we want to do something, we can afford to do it. So that's a radical shift. But at the same time, some things haven't changed at all. The reason that so many people were queued up out the front of those Centrelink offices was that in the 2 weeks leading up to that, we didn't massively expand the workforce at Centrelink to prepare for what we knew was coming. In the weeks leading up to that, we didn't open Centrelink offices for longer. We didn't bring in new processes. We didn't even send Centrelink staff to leave the office and walk down that queue and just take people's names and email addresses and say, we'll get back to you. Because while we've abandoned the ideology on big spending, we haven't actually jettisoned the ideology about big government at all. This government is determined to say the measures need to be temporary and targeted and use existing programs, when what we actually need to do very quickly is not just spend a lot of money, but spend the money in ways that help us get through this crisis. Health and welfare are obvious examples, but also that deliver things that will deliver lasting benefits for us in years and decades to come. But so while we've ditched the ideology about spending, great, the ideology that the public sector is somehow to be kept as small as possible is still with us. And the clearest example of that is that pretty much every successful business says we're successful because of our people. It's our people, it's our culture, it's our organisation. That's what keeps our company strong and successful. But when it comes to the public service, I fear this government still sees public sector workers as a beast that needs to be tamed, rather than an incredible resource that not only needs to be harnessed, but in this stage of crisis, expanded to meet all of the pressing problems we face.
Okay, well, I might start going to questions now, if that's okay, Wayne and Richard. But before I go on, I forgot to do the acknowledgement of country at the beginning of this, so I do apologise for that. Normally, the Australia Institute is in Canberra, and that's Ngunnawal country, but I'm actually staying with my brother at the moment, so I'm on Yuin country at the moment, and I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm currently living, past and present, and to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander attendees who are here with us today. And thank you to Miriam for reminding me that I'd forgotten to do that. So we're going to go to a question now from Maxine Harding that's been upvoted by a number of people. And then Lachlan McCall, if you are on the line still, we're going to come to you and get you to ask your question in person. So Maxine asks, for Wayne and Richard, your thoughts on a universal basic income, that current social security payments seem so ad hoc and complex and requiring layers of bureaucracy. Is it time for a universal basic income? First to you, Wayne.
Well, universal basic income has got a role to play, and I think that's particularly the case in the developing world. I'm not sure it's as suitable for a developed economy such as ours, which has had a fine history of a strong social social safety net. It's a very strong history of a social safety net. And if you considered a universal basic income in the current environment, what would you be doing? You'd be paying it to those sectors of the workforce that are still in work, and large parts of the economy are still working. So I don't think a universal basic income would work in the situation that we're in. My view for the long term is that rather than a universal basic income, we need a generous, well-targeted social security system which recognises that the pursuit of mobility and social opportunity is the key to a successful economy and successful society. So I'd rather fix up the social security system, which we once led the world with but don't now, rather than paying money to, if you like, Gina Rinehart or a whole lot of people who don't need it.
Richard, briefly?
Look, I generally agree. For those that don't know, a universal basic income literally means the government provides a same level of minimum income to everybody, whether they're unemployed, a retired aged pensioner, or a billionaire, or someone just working in a high-paid job. It has all sorts of administrative advantages. It sort of says, hey, look, everyone's the same, everyone's got some money, everyone can relax. But at this point in time, as Wayne said, what we're actually trying to do is redistribute income. We're not starting from a blank sheet of paper in Australia. We're starting from a whole set of structures. And right now, a universal basic income would be literally posting checks to Gina Rinehart or myself, whose job is still secure, when I'd actually rather provide more income to those who are missing out. So I think an important step towards a UBI that hopefully everyone could agree with is that, as Wayne said, we need a far more generous, I'd say far more level approach to welfare, not punish people who are on unemployment benefits and pay a lot more to age pensioners. I'd be more generous to everybody that finds themselves in need of help. But in the middle of this crisis, I wouldn't be posting me a check. I'd rather post them a bigger check.
Lachlan McCall, I'm going to come to you in just a second, but just a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question live, please raise your hand and I'll try and come to you there. And Lachlan, after you, we are going to go to Wendy Tubman's question. So Lachlan, over to you.
Sure. Thanks, thanks Ebony, thanks Wayne and Richard. My question is it time to consider an employer of last resort or job guarantee scheme, given the Victorian government has announced their Working for Victoria program, and Wayne in particular, wouldn't a greater reliance on automatic fiscal stabilisers help address some of those problems you were alluding to earlier with discretionary policy where potentially stimulus can be withdrawn too quickly? Thanks.
Sure. Well, I'm in favour of putting a full employment objective front and centre of our fiscal policy as well as our industry policy. I think we've got to do a lot more. I think a job guarantee in some form has got a lot going for it, but our objective has to be full employment, if you like, similar to the commitment that was given post-war by Chifley, and that may well involve some form of job guarantee. We're nowhere near that. Secondly, our objective during the global financial crisis was to do everything we could to keep unemployment down. So unemployment didn't move that much above 6%, and we came out of the crisis in great nick, that is, with a relatively low level of unemployment, because we did deploy fiscal policy. The automatic stabilisers were working, which is what we were criticised for doing. That is, going into deficit, spending to boost demand, and to keep people in employment. So I'm a great believer in being a Keynesian on the way up and a Keynesian on the way down. Now, I know that'll spark a bit more of a debate with a number of people, but we should never be afraid to use our fiscal firepower to protect the employment of our people. And that's why I'm pleased that fiscal firepower is now being used by this government to protect our people. And what we need to talk about is some of the issues that you raised. How do we do it? How does it relate to budget policy and so on?
Sorry, go Richard.
Look, I agree. I remember giving evidence at the Senate Economics inquiry into the stimulus package, where the coalition were trying to make the case that that too much money was spent during during the GFC. And my response at the time was, well, we know we didn't spend too much money because we never saw inflation. Like there can't have been too much stimulus because all we saw was unemployment falling and all we saw was inflation being controlled. So there was clearly never a point post GFC where we were spending too much money. And I think moving forward, we need to keep that in mind. If we've got high unemployment and no inflation, then we're not spending enough money. The government is not creating enough demand to soak up labour, and whether they soak it up through something like a job guarantee, something like a big expansion of the traditional public sector, or a combination of both. Look, you know, the economist in me says either will work, but certainly having a job guarantee does create that automatic stabiliser, as the questioner said, that you don't have to have policy stepping up just the minute people can't find a job. We give them one, hopefully doing something useful, hopefully doing something that provides benefits to the community now and in the future. We have to fill the hole created by what we've done in crushing so much of our economy. Only the public sector can do it.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Wayne. I'm going to ask, there's a couple of different questions that kind of get to the environment and climate change. Wendy, for example, Wendy Tubman asks, how do we better incorporate the environment into national accounts? While Luke Haler asks, will ecological sustainability be a priority in a post-COVID economics scenario? And if so, how can we ensure accountability to this? I wonder if you could speak to that general theme, Wayne.
Well, I think post this crisis, but for that matter, before this crisis, our twin priorities ought to be a reduction in inequality, and then secondly, a massive investment in clean energy, and a massive reduction in our emissions. And I think Ross Garnaut and, of course, many at the Australia Institute have written many long and learned articles about how we go about it. So as part of the objective of coming back to full employment, there has to be this transition in our economy from fossil fuels through to clean, green, renewable energy. And this will present an even bigger opportunity as part of a revamped industry policy. It'll be a key part of the reindustrialisation of Australia. And as Ross Garnaut has outlined very clearly, that is now possible. Having the best renewable resources in the world provides the opportunity for Australia to reindustrialise based on cheaper energy coming from renewable energy, and making here some of the industrial products that in the last 20 or 30 years have moved offshore. And when that is combined with the threat that we now see arising from the pandemic, that our self-sufficiency in certain industries must be paramount, we can join that capacity building in industries which are strategic for the future with the renewable energy agenda. I think it presents an enormously exciting opportunity for Australia. And that's what I meant when I said at the introduction that it's not only how we deal with this crisis, it's how we come out of it and how we pay for it and how we set the country up for the future. As Jim Chalmers said in the Parliament so clearly yesterday, Chifley and Curtin in 1942 began planning for what Australia would look like after the war. And when the war ended, they were ready for a massive series of investments and a recreation of the economy based on full employment. And that should be our objective.
Richard?
Look, I agree entirely. I mean, it's hard for people to believe what I'm about to say, but economics isn't about money. Economics is about resources. Economics is about the efficient allocation of scarce resources. And one of the most wasteful things any society can do is have millions of people sitting around doing nothing, that is, being unemployed. So leave the money aside temporarily. What a government has to do during a period of mass unemployment is find productive work for those people to do. If the private sector demand for their services isn't there, only the public sector can create that demand. And that's what Wayne was just talking about. What happened when you demobilise a military? they knew they were going to have hundreds of thousands of people coming back from overseas to do what? They didn't just wait for the market to figure out what all those returned soldiers were going to be employed to do. They actually came up with a plan for what all those people should do. Well, the same is true now. The Prime Minister keeps telling us this is not going to be quick, this is not going to be quick. So what we have to ask ourselves is, what are the tasks that we can get stuck into right now that don't just create income for people, but actually create lasting benefits for our community, our economy, and our environment? And, you know, what better time, for example, to invest in renewable energy and energy efficiency? There's all sorts of simple retrofitting projects that will create a lot of demand for labour and deliver cheaper electricity bills for 20 years to come. What better time to say to the private sector that was installing solar panels all across Australia, whose demand has now dried up, that's all right, we want you to do that on town halls and community buildings and schools. Wherever we can, we need to be employing skilled labour where the private sector demand isn't there. And again, I think the post-war mobilisation is even more important a metaphor than the idea of mobilising for war. At the end of a war, when hundreds of thousands of people have to come home and do something new, it took a lot of planning and a lot of public sector guidance to ensure their time and efforts weren't wasted. And all this talk about the stimulus today is about spending the money. It's not at the moment about creating demand for important things that will deliver lasting benefits.
Thanks, Richard. I'm hoping to come to Helen James next, but I'm just having trouble unmuting you. I'm sorry, Helen. Let me see if I can do that. Talking. Are you there, Helen?
Yes, but I don't have a question. I don't know how that's come up.
Oh, because you've raised your hand, that's why.
I can add to that answer that Richard gave.
Yeah.
I think so, if you look at something like the NDIS, now it hasn't been properly funded by the government because they were never fully supportive, but the NDIS is a perfect example of what a country could do. It's a very good example of the policy making process to put together the program to meet the need. And of course, if you look at the employment numbers in Australia, it's largely been people employed in the NDIS that have provided a lot of the job growth that was, because it's been weak and anemic elsewhere, a lot of the job growth we've seen for the last couple of years. But that sort of program, meeting an unmet need in the community, mobilising the country, getting the policy framework, getting the community together, that can be applied to a number of sectors. And indeed, it must be applied to a number of sectors if we're going to achieve the full employment that we aspire to.
The next question is from Nathan Feld. He asks, is it time to reassess the supply chain model and start to think about being more independent of our foreign suppliers and look more at local production?
Absolutely. The way in which the government, for example, drove the car industry out of Australia was a tragedy for the country. You could have an argument about whether we're the best place to make cars in the world, but what we knew was, as being part of that process, we developed essential skills for our workforce and for our country. I've always been a believer in a focused industry policy, not necessarily at any cost, but there are certain sectors of our economy that we need for national self-sufficiency. That's why it's important to be building, for example, some of our military projects here. It's why it's important that we should be manufacturing medical equipment, for example. It's why it's important to do something about domestic petroleum refining, even though we want to phase it out. The government has left our country naked when it comes to supplies of oil, the most basic driver of our current economy. So yes, we need a reinvigorated industry policy that speaks to the capacity of our workforce and looks to the strategic demands that we will face in the future, whether it's the health of our people or whether it's the security of our nation.
Before I go to you, Richard, Tim Diamond, I'm hoping you've got a question. Sorry for calling on you, Helen, when you didn't have one. We'll come to you shortly. Tim, Richard.
Yeah, look, Australia is part of a world economy. We're an exporter, we're an importer. since we colonised Australia, we've been engaged in trade. But in the last couple of decades, Australians have been told that we have no choice. You've always got to be careful when people tell you you've got no choice. It usually means they're trying to persuade you to follow their choice. We've been told for decades that we have no choice but to offshore an incredible array of production and services. And of course, we did have a choice. And there are benefits to Australia in being part of global supply chains. There's no doubt about that. But there are also costs and there are also risks. So much of neoliberalism, so much of the kind of zealous free trade agenda has revolved around saying there's no choice. All that matters is getting these things at the cheapest possible price today. Don't worry about quality. Don't worry about national security. Don't even worry about sort of privacy, let alone labour standards or environment standards. Just look at the price. Well, that was never a good idea. And what we're seeing now is that completely exposed. And we're beginning to see the government say, well, after this, we should always have the capacity to make respirators here in Australia. Well, that's good. But we don't know what the next crisis will look like. We don't know what form it will take. Will it be a pandemic or something else? To have a strong, resilient economy is different from having an economy that is only ever focuses on getting everything you can as cheap as you possibly can. The metaphor I like to use is that of a Formula One racing car. It's designed to be as fast as possible. It's every component is as light as can be imagined, but they're incredibly useless if they do something like hit a pothole. The cars we drive around are nothing like a Formula One car. The cars we drive around are designed with spare capacity all over, seats in the back in case someone wants to come with us, crumple zones, airbags, all sorts of things to keep us safe, massively over-engineered suspension so we can hit a really big pothole and not break our car. So for decades, we've been told we have to cut costs, we have to be lean, we have to be mean, there is no choice. Well, what we're seeing now is that having tried to build a racing car of an economy, it's entirely incapable of being resilient to an unexpected shock. We didn't have to go that far in the past couple of decades, and hopefully in the decades to come, we'll never make ourselves as vulnerable as that. And as vulnerable, we didn't just make the economy vulnerable, what we made was the most vulnerable people in Australia vulnerable, with terrible working conditions and relying on imports made in countries with even worse working conditions.
Thanks, Richard and Wayne. Just wanting to give a big shout out to all the participants that we've got before we come to Tim Diamond's question. We've had close to 2,000 participants today. I think this is probably the biggest event the Australia Institute has actually ever run. So thank you everyone who's tuned in. And apologies that the chat function appears to be disabled. We'll fix that for the next one, but a lot of great questions coming through. Tim Diamond, what's your question?
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, so my question might be a little niche, but it's essentially about the future roles of ratings agencies. I'm thinking sort of Fitch, Standard & Poor's and things like that. Yes, well, may you laugh. But they should have been
so easy.
Yeah, they should have been discredited after the global financial crisis, but clearly weren't. And not only the federal government, but also state governments, including state Labor governments, and certainly local councils still use the sort of cult of the AAA credit rating as a kind of shorthand way of communicating fiscal health. I mean, given that, as you say, the sheer volume of money that the governments around the world are spending, and we've apparently stopped asking things like how they're going to pay for it, is there finally a chance of dislodging the sort of central and I think quite pernicious role of these agencies in imposing so-called discipline on governments that seems to be actively harmful?
Okay. Well, at the height of the crisis, I referred to this before, I had to fly to New York in January of 2009, and I privately went there to see the rating agency, Standard & Poor's. because they have been betting a tom-tom that in fact they were going to downgrade Australia's ratings. Now, as it turned out, they didn't move that way. And as it turned out, Australia became, I think, the first time Australia received a positive rating from all the three major credit rating agencies was in 2011 when Labor was in government. But the truth is that we should not have been considered for a downgrade at the height of the crisis, but given the condition of the economy then, and we most certainly shouldn't be considered for a downgrade given the state of our economy now. There were big question marks raised through the G20 process after the Great Recession, and there was talk of reform of the rating agency process and so on. But from my point of view, it's very much hit and miss. We're right to be deeply sceptical, and they do at some times and in some places have too much influence. I'm not as familiar with the work that they do with many of our large corporates, and maybe there's a valuable role there. But when it comes to sovereign ratings, I've got a great degree of scepticism about their usefulness.
Look, I agree, and it's a really important question. Thanks for asking it. So for everyone's sort of, if you're not sure, the ratings agencies provide information to help people that might be thinking about lending money to someone compare the relative risks of that. Now, as Wayne said, in the corporate sector, in the private sector, I think they actually have a role to play. If there's two companies, one's the Commonwealth Bank of Australia and one's some startup that you've never heard of, and they both want to borrow money, the ratings agencies help people with money to lend choose who's safer, who's more likely. But what people don't realise is that when they say, the Commonwealth Bank is AAA rated, and when they say the Commonwealth of Australia is AAA rated, those two ratings have literally nothing to do with each other. They are rated against entirely separate criteria. And to give you some context, there is absolutely zero chance that any Australian government in the last 50 years would have defaulted on any of their loans. And that hasn't changed in 50 years. Right? Whether it was John Howard, Bob Hawke, Paul Keating, Wayne and Kevin, it doesn't matter. Australia was never going to default on those loans. But the ratings agencies are a bit like movie critics. If they gave every Australian government 5 stars for being the safest people in Australia you could possibly lend money to, no one would tune in. What would be the point of paying attention to a movie critic that said, every movie that the Australian government ever made was 5 stars? So we actually have this bizarre symbolism where we kind of tinker with AA, A-, all this complete nonsense, when in reality, the underlying risk that the Australian government won't repay its loans is zero, and it's been zero under every government in living memory. So the ratings agencies have a function to play in the private sector, but in the public sector, it's just a tool of ideology. When governments say the kind of things that bankers like to hear, like let's cut taxes and let's cut spending, they give you a boost. And if you say, oh, we might spend more on an NDIS or climate change, they mark you down. I mean, how embarrassing that a nation state, that a proud, rich country would care what some analyst in New York thinks of our decision making. So yeah, they didn't see the GFC coming. They were encouraging people to lend money to banks that failed, and then they want to tell the Australian people that we shouldn't spend more on health and education. Tell them to get stuffed.
Well, I'll ask what you really think next time, Richard. We've got 2 last questions that I want to touch on, and I'm really sorry for everyone that we weren't able to get to, but I'm just trying to cover as many topics as we can. We've got a number of people asking about donut economics. I'm not sure if either of you are familiar with that, but also a couple of people asking about does the gig economy have a future when we've seen how precarious and insecure that work is? So Wayne, to you first.
I'll do the gig economy if you like.
Yeah, great.
Well, I think the gig economy in so many ways describes so much that is wrong with the current model we operate in, which I'll broadly call the trickle-down model. Effectively, there's a whole group of people out there being exploited without essential conditions and no power at all to bargain for their labour. And that, to me, is intolerable. It has to be dealt with over time. The fact that the people doing Deliveroo, Uber Eats and all of those and many, many more, the people that are now probably delivering all of the packages because we're all at home and not going to the shops, all of them are being massively exploited. And I think if we've learnt one thing from the last 10 or 20 years of economics and politics, is that the creation of insecure work, casualised work, contracting out and so on, has exploited a whole generation of people who are not enjoying the benefits of growth that so many other Australians have access to. And part of the debate about full employment and job guarantees and so on is ensuring that we can extend across a range of areas some basic minimum conditions.
Richard, donut economics?
Look, I'll talk donuts in a second, but look, just very quickly, yeah, the gig economy, it evolved during that period that all Australian governments like to talk about, that 29 years of uninterrupted growth. And during that 29 years of uninterrupted growth, a whole bunch of people, brackets, mainly young people, were told, you don't really need sick leave, you don't really need holiday leave, you don't really need a safety net. Look, this economy, it always grows. If you're smart and hardworking, you'll be okay. Look, some people were, and some people did really well out of it, but it was always a tightrope. And I guess, I'm 50. I think people like me, my first experience with the labour market was 18 months of unemployment during the recession we had that. I've always loved having sick leave. I've always loved having a paycheck that came in every week. I'm so conservative about that. So I think the gig economy was a fairy tale story, but you could tell it during a period of unprecedented prosperity. And I think, there's an old saying, you don't see the rocks till the tide goes out. Well, a lot of people in the gig economy are seeing now just how dangerous that can be. I'm not blaming them for it. I'm saying that the story just doesn't work these days. As for donut economics, I do like a donut. But the metaphor of donut economics is really about saying that you need to take ecological, I've got a bit of donut in my throat. You got to take ecological boundaries into account when we think about economic growth, and we need to think about things like community and social cohesion. And that, really it's a visual representation. I encourage people to have a look at it, but it's basically just saying you can't just make more stuff all the time. I tend to agree, but the way I express that is we need to pay as much attention to the shape of our economy as we do to the size of the economy. Growing some parts of our economy creates wealth and happiness and well-being. Growing other parts of our economy creates pollution and insecurity and all sorts of problems that we might like to avoid. When we combine them all together and say, oh, they're all growth, I think we miss out on something simple and important. What we want to do, I think, is have growth of the bits of the economy we like and want more of. And if there are bits of the economy that are causing us problems, well, we probably want them to decline over time. And we shouldn't get caught up in, is growth good or bad? We should have a simple conversation about what do we want more of and what do we want less of.
Thanks, Richard. And just a final question from Craig Wood. Will Wayne be pulling out that guitar in the bookcase and giving us some Springsteen covers?
No, just loud singing.
Well, I want to thank you both for joining us, but you in particular, Wayne Swan, thank you so much for your time today. I think that was a really wonderful discussion and some really great insights looking back from your experience during the GFC.
Thank you.
Thanks, Richard, for your time as well. And thank you to everyone who has joined us today. This, I would like to remind everyone, is being recorded, and we'll make that recording available to you all after this discussion. Thank you all so much for your questions. They were so great, and I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of them, but we do appreciate you coming. Thanks to everyone who has come from the Saturday paper, as well as regular Australia Institute supporters. It's really lovely to see you all. And please stay tuned at tai.org.au and make sure you signed up for future webinars that we do host. Our next one will be on the arts industry and what coronavirus has done to the arts. That's going to be next Wednesday at 11 a.m. with Green Senator Sarah Hanson-Young, spokesperson for the arts, and Melanie Tate, playwright and author, as well as Richard Dennis to answer the economic bits of that equation. If you are in a position to chip in a few dollars to help us cover the costs of this webinar, which aren't free to host, please, if you are in a position to chip in a few dollars on our website at tai.org.au, because every little bit does help. So once again, don't forget to sign up for our webinar for next week. And if you haven't checked out our podcast, Follow the Money, the latest episode makes the case for a New Zealand-style epidemic response committee and for scrutiny of the government's COVID decisions. And we had a big win on that yesterday with the Senate passing a committee of that nature. So a huge congratulations to all the Australia Institute supporters and other community organisations who backed that campaign for greater scrutiny, and to the retired judges who spearheaded that call convened by the Australia Institute. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you for all your questions. Wayne, is there anything else you want to wrap up by saying?
Stay safe.
Richard?
Wash your hands, people.
And stay at home if you can, particularly over the Easter period. And don't forget to check health.gov.au for any health